Here's the thing. It takes something extraordinary to make a US president suspend trade talks with one of America's closest allies, but that's exactly what Donald Trump did after a single ad aired in Canada. The ad wasn't a political attack, at least not in the traditional sense. It used the actual voice of Ronald Reagan, the conservative icon Trump so often tries to claim as his spiritual predecessor, criticizing tariffs. That was all it took. Within hours, Trump called the ad a fraud and a hostile act. He slapped another 10% tariff hike on Canadian imports and froze ongoing trade negotiations. Ontario's Premier Doug Ford, whose province funded the ad, promised to pull it after the weekend, but the damage was done. What we're looking at here isn't just a trade dispute, it's a snapshot of how personal grievance has become national policy, and how the separation of powers in Washington is failing to stop it. The ad that lit the fuse. Let's start with what actually happened. The Ontario provincial government aired a 30-second ad during the American League Championship Series, a moment of maximum visibility. The ad featured an excerpt from a 1987 Ronald Reagan radio address, in which the then president explained why he was reluctantly imposing duties on Japanese goods. In that speech, Reagan said tariffs were a dangerous tool that often destroy America's economy and put millions out of work. In other words, the Gipper was making a narrow exception, not endorsing protectionism. Trump's reaction? Fury. He accused Ontario of manipulating Reagan's words, calling the ad a fraud and a hostile act against the United States. The irony? The audio was authentic, verified, and unaltered in substance. The Wall Street Journal's editorial board even weighed in, saying Reagan was clearly a free trader, and that Trump shouldn't take Reagan's trade beliefs in vain. So, why such an overreaction? Because Reagan isn't just a Republican president to Trump, he's the brand Trump wants to inherit. Seeing Reagan's actual words weaponized against his tariff narrative wasn't just inconvenient, it was humiliating. A trade war born from ego. Here's what this really means. Trump's decision to impose a new 10% tariff wasn't based on economics. It wasn't about national security. It wasn't even about trade imbalance. It was about ego. His administration now argues before the Supreme Court that these tariffs are justified under national emergency powers. But the supposed emergency isn't China or Russia or any tangible economic threat. It's a TV ad from Canada that hurt the president's feelings. That's not hyperbole. Even conservative commentators are calling it out. The Wall Street Journal put it bluntly, the emergency argument has always been specious at best, now it's been laid bare. The heart of the issue is this. Trump has treated the power to impose tariffs like a personal weapon, a kind of executive magic wand. One day it's China, the next, Brazil, now Canada. When challenged, he rebrands each episode as a national emergency. But when every inconvenience becomes an emergency, the word stops meaning anything. Separation of powers on trial. The Supreme Court is now at the center of this. Trump's legal team is arguing that the president can impose tariffs unilaterally under emergency authority. That authority is supposed to be narrow, reserved for actual crises like war or global financial collapse. If the court backs Trump, it would set a dangerous precedent, one where the president can raise or lower taxes, because tariffs are taxes, without congressional approval. It's exactly what the Founding Fathers designed the separation of powers to prevent. And yet, so far the court has largely stayed silent. It hasn't intervened when Trump sent the Marines to Los Angeles under vague public safety claims. It hasn't stepped in as he's used emergency powers to move the National Guard into cities he labels dangerous. As the panelists in that segment put it, the court's silence almost offers its own blessing. That silence has consequences. Every time the judiciary or Congress fails to act, the executive grows stronger. the US government starts to look less like a democracy and more like a monarchy wrapped in procedural paperwork. Congress, the other missing branch. Let's not let Congress off the hook. The Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, gives Congress, not the President, the authority to regulate trade and impose tariffs. But instead of defending that power, Congress has spent the past few years hiding behind vague statutes and letting presidents, first Obama, then Trump, expand executive reach. When Trump imposed steel and aluminum tariffs in 2018, lawmakers grumbled. When he threatened tariffs on Mexico to force migration policy changes, they fumed, but they didn't act. Now, with Canada caught in the crossfire, the same cowardice continues. Lawmakers complain, issue statements, and then retreat. As one analyst put it, the cowardice of the first branch and the third branch is what lets the second branch act like a king. That's the crux of the crisis, not just Trump's personality but the system's inability to rein him in. Economic fallout and business chaos. While Washington argues over principles, businesses are caught in the crossfire. Major American companies are warning that the constant tariff swings make it impossible to plan for the future. Executives say they can't predict what tariffs will exist next month, let alone next year. Should they build a new factory in Ohio or Mexico? Should they expand exports or freeze them? Nobody knows, because Trump's policies change with his mood. Tariffs don't just hurt Canada. They hit US manufacturers, retailers, and consumers. Prices rise, supply chains wobble, and cross-border industries, especially in Michigan, where the US and Canada's economies are deeply intertwined, start to suffer. And remember, Canada isn't China. It's America's neighbor, its second-largest trading partner, and arguably its closest ally. No one in Michigan or New York or Washington wants to see Canadians as adversaries. That's why this feels different. It's not just reckless, it's embarrassing. The Reagan factor, and the image war part of what makes this episode sting, is symbolic. Trump has always wrapped himself in Reagan's image, the portraits, the slogans, even the nostalgia for 1980s conservatism. But the ad from Ontario flipped that imagery against him. It reminded Americans that Reagan, the hero of the Republican right, believed tariffs were destructive and trade wars were a losing game. Trump reportedly keeps Reagan's portrait near every official photo op in the Oval Office. The idea that his idol would have opposed his signature economic weapon cuts deep. The ad hit the one nerve that truly gets a reaction, the challenge to Trump's self-image. And that's where this entire controversy turns from policy to psychology. Pulse News bottom line. This isn't a story about tariffs or trade deals anymore. It's a case study in how personal emotion and political power have fused at the highest level of government. Trump's tariff war with Canada shows how fragile the US separation of powers has become. The Supreme Court hesitates, Congress hides, and the executive branch grows bolder by the day, using national emergency as a fig leaf for personal vendetta.